Hello again, everyone. Welcome to part 4, the final part of our Chapter 1 lecture series, where we'll be discussing the French and Dutch presence in the New World. The focus question for this section is, what were the chief features of the French and Dutch empires in North America? Beginning with the French presence in the New World, French colonization was initially driven by an impetus to find gold. That same sort of impetus that drove many of those Spanish early colonists as well. But they also wanted to seek a northwest passage, a sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That same drive that drove Christopher Columbus west into the Atlantic still swam around in the minds of Europeans, seeking a route to Asia that bypassed those land routes along the old Silk Road east into Asia from Europe, and the sea routes that went all the way around the bottom of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Now, of course, especially given the fact that the world was still mired at the time in the middle of this little ice age that we have been discussing, there just was no northwest passage to be found at the time. So, in a trade-off there, the economic activity that the French finally settled upon was the fur trade. Furs of animals such as deer, such as beaver, were in high demand in Europe at the time, and these sorts of animals were plentiful in the regions that would become New France. And they quickly found some Indian allies who were more than willing to hunt up all the deer and the beaver and other animals that could be utilized for their fur and trade them to the French for European trade goods. Now, in 1608, the city of Quebec was founded by this gentleman that you see right here, Samuel de Champlain, which was the first major French settlement in the New World. Eventually, the French claimed the entire Mississippi River Valley as they explored, beginning at the headwaters of the Mississippi, which are up there around the current United States-Canadian border, all the way south to where it empties out into the Gulf of Mexico. While the French claimed a huge swath of land in what is now modern-day Canada and along the Mississippi River Valley and much of the current northeast United States, they had some significant trouble actually enticing settlers into this region, mainly because of the lack of economic activity other than the fur trade and the often harsh climatic conditions in the region, coupled along with the fact that other than the Huguenots in French, there just was not a whole lot of interest amongst the wider French community for large-scale immigration at the time. So, because of the lack of immigration and the reliance on this fur trade for the bulk of the economic activity in the region, the viability of New France became heavily reliant on friendly relations with local Indians. They developed a complex series of military, commercial, and diplomatic connections with the Indian tribes of the region as they sought greater access to this fur trade that drove the economy of New France. The Jesuits were also a significant presence in the region. The French were also a Catholic people like the Spanish, and the Jesuits found not an insignificant number of converts amongst the local Indians, and begin to see a merging of French and Indian cultures in the regions. Now, of course, the contact with the French and the desire of the French for increasing numbers of furs brought substantial changes to the Indians' lives in the region. It really tied them in with this burgeoning Atlantic economy as they began to really centered their lives and their own economic activity around that fur trade, which also brought them into conflict with not only other European powers, but also with surrounding tribes, as each tribe competed for access to that fur trade to gain the European trade goods that they began to covet more and more. Now, all of this fostered huge cultural exchange and even intermixing between the French and the Indian populations. Again, like in the Spanish regions, most of the French immigrants into the region were young men who were seeking access to that fur trade. There wasn't a whole lot of French women that immigrated along with them. So as a result, a lot of intermarriage happened. That intermarriage was part for personal reasons. Everybody needs a little bit of company. But also for access to those communities of Indians, because once they became part of those families, they were plugged in to the economic activities of those communities, which allowed them greater access to the fur trade. Now, this cultural mixing and the offspring that resulted from them were known as métis, which you can see in this picture right here, a artist's rendering of a métis man who was a mix of French and Indian descent, along with two of his wives, more than likely both of them Indian women. Now, like the French, the initial impetus for the Dutch was also the seeking of this famed Northwest Passage that didn't exist. In 1609, Henry Hudson, who was actually an English navigator, but who sailed on behalf of the Dutch at the time, went on a voyage to seek this Northwest Passage. And on this voyage, he claimed the area that includes modern-day New York City for the Netherlands. Now, in the 17th century, the Dutch were really the first European power to establish a large-scale international commercial empire. They dominated international commerce and invented the joint stock company, which led to major wealth for the Netherlands. Now, joint stock companies were a brand new form of business ventures that allowed multiple investors to invest in one business, which mitigated the individual risk among the investors. And this really set the stage for the development later of kind of the modern corporate structure as we know it today. Much like the French, the Dutch also had a difficult time attracting settlers to their New World settlements. The economic situation in the Netherlands was very good. Business was booming, so there was not a whole lot of discontented peoples in the Netherlands that would seek immigration into a land, especially one as wild and untamed as the American wilderness at the time. So to try to counter this and attract people to these settlements, the Dutch offered large landed estates to people who became known as patroons. Now, these landholders agreed to transport tenants into their land holdings, and really these estates came to be run much like a medieval manor, and it was really kind of a reconstitution of that old feudal system that was ironically in its final death throes in Europe at the time. So just as that system was ending in Europe, it was being attempted to be reconstituted in a fashion in the New World. Now, during the 17th century, the Dutch sent over 1 million people overseas, but the majority of those went to the Dutch holdings in the Caribbean and the Dutch holdings in Asia at the time. New Netherland remained really a tiny backwater community. Now, the Dutch relations with the Indians was similar to the French relations with the Indians. The Dutch came to trade. They did not come to conquer. They recognized Indian sovereignty over the land, and they especially established friendly economic and diplomatic connections with the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a confederacy of 5 tribes in that northeast area of the modern United States and the southeast area of modern Canada, right along that St. Lawrence River Valley and the Great Lakes. This Iroquois Confederacy was a very powerful and organized Indian confederation that really controlled and dominated both the trade and military matters of the region at the time. We've reached the end of our lecture series for Chapter 1. I certainly hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned a lot. I have put a few other YouTube videos that might be of interest to you in the same folder in which you found this particular presentation that will elaborate a little further and go in a little bit more detail on some of the things that we've been discussing in these lectures. I think you'll find them interesting and insightful. For now, that's it. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.